In the vast expanse of space, where common sense went to die and bureaucracy flourished like an invasive species, the Galactic Defense Corps had once again outdone themselves in the art of spectacular overconfidence. Their latest masterpiece? The X-779 Impenetrable Combat Armor System, a name that practically begged the universe to prove them wrong. The presentation chamber of the Rigellian Defense Research Institute buzzed with the kind of excitement usually reserved for watching paint dry in zero gravity. High-ranking officials from 17 species filled the amphitheater, their varied anatomies crammed into standardized seating that somehow managed to be uncomfortable for everyone equally, a true testament to universal design. As you can see, droned Chief Designer Zix 427 Beta, their bioluminescent patches pulsing with pride. Our new armor system incorporates quantum-locked neutronium weave with self-repairing nanomatrices. The holographic display showed a rotating model of the armor, which looked like someone had asked an AI to draw a knight after feeding it nothing but modern art and technical manuals. From the back row, a maintenance worker who would rather not be named, because paperwork is a pain, watched with the kind of expression humans reserve for watching someone about to step on a rake. The worker had spent enough time fixing things around the facility to know that anything labeled impenetrable usually lasted about as long as a chocolate teapot in a supernova. Commander Krill X are being composed primarily of crystalline structures and institutional arrogance rose from their seat. Their faceted eyes reflected the holographic display, multiplying the image of the armor into a kaleidoscope of impending disaster. And you say this has been tested against all known weapons? Absolutely. Zix's voice modulator practically squeaked with enthusiasm. We've subjected it to plasma cannons, antimatter warheads, and even that peculiar human invention. What do they call it? Ah, yes, the shotgun. They pronounced the word as if it was some quaint cultural curiosity, like discovering a species that still used interpretive dance for mathematical calculations. The human maintenance worker suppressed a snort that could have been heard in vacuum. They had noticed something about the armor's joint design that reminded them of their cousin's attempt at unbreakable garden furniture right before it collapsed during a particularly aggressive game of charades. "But what about Deathworlders?" asked a nervous-looking Venetian diplomat, their tentacles twisting anxiously. "Specifically humans?" The word humans rippled through the chamber like a stone dropped in a pond of collective anxiety. The galactic community had classified Earth as a death world centuries ago, right after their first survey team had been traumatized by something they called a squirrel. The fact that humans not only survived but thrived in an environment that could only be described as nature's mosh pit had earned them a reputation somewhere between respect and terror. "Absolutely no concern," Zix declared, their confidence reaching levels that should have triggered safety protocols. "The armor can withstand forces up to 300 times stronger than a human's maximum exertion. We even ran simulations against historical human warfare tactics, including something called percussive maintenance, which we still don't quite understand." The maintenance worker's hand twitched involuntarily at this statement, remembering how many times percussive maintenance had saved their neck when the station's life support decided to take an unscheduled coffee break. As the presentation continued, filled with enough technical jargon to make a dictionary feel inadequate, the human noticed something else. The armor's power distribution system had a peculiar design that looked suspiciously like it was conceived during a caffeine-induced hallucination. They made a mental note to update their personal emergency evacuation plan. "And now," Zix announced with the flourish of someone about to tempt fate, "we begin production immediately. The first units will be deployed to our highest-risk facilities, including this very research institute." The assembled dignitaries erupted in applause, while the human maintenance worker quietly added "purchase personal shield generator" to their to-do list, right between fix quantum coffee maker and avoid being around when everything inevitably goes wrong. Little did anyone know eventually would arrive much sooner than expected, and wrong would prove to be a laughably inadequate description of what was about to unfold. But that's the thing about the universe. It has a particular fondness for proving that impenetrable is less a specification and more of a challenge. As the crowd filed out, discussing profit margins and production quotas with the enthusiasm of accountants at a spreadsheet convention, nobody noticed the small stress fracture forming in the sample armor's joint. Nobody except a certain human who was already calculating the odds of their disaster leave request being approved before everything went sideways. The universe, meanwhile, was warming up its sense of irony for what would soon become a legendary testament to the fact that some lessons need to be learned the hard way, preferably with a side of humble pie and a garnish of shattered expectations. 3 weeks after the presentation that tempted Murphy's Law into working overtime, the Research Institute had transformed into something resembling a militarized fashion show. Guards strutted around in their new X-779 armor, looking like chrome-plated peacocks who had raided a sci-fi prop department. The human maintenance worker, still doing their best to remain nameless, because being on a first-name basis with disaster was best avoided, found themselves fixing yet another malfunctioning door panel, while 2 guards discussed their new equipment with all the sophistication of children comparing toy collections. "The neural interface is so responsive," bragged Guard Lieutenant Paxtil, their mandibles clicking excitedly beneath their helmet. "Yesterday I thought about scratching my thorax, and the armor adjusted before I even moved." "That's nothing," replied Guard Captain Neem-12, whose species communicated through bioluminescent patterns and somehow managed to make them look smug. "Watch this." The captain proceeded to demonstrate a series of combat stances that made them look like a disco dancer having an existential crisis. The maintenance worker, elbow-deep in wiring that had decided to practice interpretive dance, tried very hard not to notice how the armor's joints creaked during certain movements. The sound reminded them of their aunt's ancient rocking chair right before it had surrendered to gravity during a particularly dramatic retelling of a family story. Meanwhile, in the facility's main laboratory, Chief Designer Zix 427 Beta was discovering that success had the unfortunate side effect of attracting administrators like quantum particles attracted observers, unavoidable and fundamentally disturbing. "The board of directors is very impressed," declared Administrator Vix Ultra Prime, a being whose species had evolved from something like bureaucratic bacteria. "They're suggesting we scale up production by 500% and skip the extended testing phase." The human, passing by with a toolkit that contained more backup plans than actual tools, nearly dropped a wrench. They'd learned long ago that skip the testing phase ranked right up there with "what's the worst that could happen" in the lexicon of phrases that preceded disaster. "But the stress testing under variable conditions," Zix began, only to be cut off by a wave of Administrator Vix's appendage, which managed to convey "profit margins are more important than physics" in a single gesture. "The preliminary results are more than adequate," Vix declared with the confidence of someone who had never had to face the consequences of their decisions. "Besides, we've already received orders from 17 different security forces." The maintenance worker, who had developed a sixth sense for impending catastrophe, a necessary survival trait for anyone working in advanced research facilities, noticed how the administrator's own ceremonial armor set was making subtle popping sounds as they moved, the kind of sounds that usually preceded what their old engineering professor had termed rapid unplanned disassembly. Later that day, during what was supposed to be a routine maintenance check of the facility's defense systems, the human found themselves sharing a lift with Lieutenant Pixtil, who had somehow managed to get their armor stuck in what could only be described as a permanent power stance. "It's just a minor calibration issue," Still insisted, while looking like a statue caught mid-sneeze. "The manual says to ignore any unexpected joint locking. It's probably just the armor adapting to my superior physical structure." The human nodded politely, the way one does when watching someone insist that the strange noise their vehicle is making is probably nothing right before the engine decides to retire early. They made a mental note to update their "I told you so" speech, which was starting to feel less like a contingency and more like an imminent necessity. In the facility's data center, the armor's performance logs were telling a story that nobody seemed interested in reading. The human, whose security clearance was just high enough to access maintenance records but low enough to be blamed if anything went wrong, noticed a pattern in the system's power fluctuations that looked suspiciously like a countdown to catastrophe. They tried filing a report, but the automated system rejected it because maintenance personnel are not qualified to assess quantum-locked neutronium weave integrity, a phrase that managed to combine bureaucratic dismissiveness with technological arrogance in a way that would have been impressive if it wasn't so concerning. As the day shift wound down, the human watched a squad of guards practicing formation maneuvers in their new armor. The scene reminded them of a documentary they'd once watched about emperor penguins, except the penguins had shown better judgment and significantly more grace. The universe, which had been patient enough to let everyone dig their own hole, nice and deep, was about to remind everyone why testing protocols existed, and why humans had developed such a rich vocabulary of words for different types of catastrophic failure. But that lesson would have to wait just a little longer, as the facility's long-range sensors picked up something that would turn an already precarious situation into what the human's old drill sergeant would have called a proper Charlie Foxtrot. The maintenance worker, checking their emergency kit for the third time that day, had no idea they were about to become the galaxy's most effective equipment tester, though not in any way the manufacturers would have preferred to advertise. The facility's alert system had exactly 3 settings: all is well, minor inconvenience, and oh dear stars, we're all going to die. At precisely 0300 hours station time, it opted for the latter, causing everyone wearing the X-779 armor to simultaneously strike what looked like a synchronized dance pose as their suits' auto-response protocols activated. "Unidentified vessels approaching," announced the AI with all the concern of someone reporting slightly overcooked toast. "Preliminary analysis suggests pirate configurations. Threat level, significant. Have a nice day." The human maintenance worker, who had been catching a quick nap in their workshop because disaster waited for no one's sleep schedule, wasn't surprised. They'd learned long ago that any sufficiently advanced technology would eventually attract pirates like politicians to photo opportunities. In the command center, chaos erupted with the coordination of a quantum particle having an identity crisis. Administrator Vix Ultra Prime's bioluminescence was flashing so rapidly it looked like a malfunctioning disco ball. "Deploy all guards, activate the defense systems, someone bring me my ceremonial armor," they shouted, their translators struggling to keep up with the panic-induced color changes. The maintenance worker, watching the security feeds while pretending to fix a malfunctioning coffee machine, which was actually working fine, they just needed an excuse to monitor the situation, noticed something concerning. The pirates' approach vector suggested they had inside information about the facility's defensive capabilities. Even more worrying, they seemed to be using signal frequencies that matched the X-779's power signature. Meanwhile, Guard Captain Neem 12 was discovering that combat situations were significantly different from training exercises. Their armor, which had been perfectly responsive during practice, was now moving with all the grace of a drunk giraffe trying to ice skate. "The targeting systems are showing some slight calibration issues," they reported, which was like saying a supernova was showing some slight warming trends. The guards' attempt to aim their weapon resulted in what looked like an interpretive dance representation of a system malfunction. Lieutenant Pixetil, still stuck in their power stance from earlier, tried to coordinate the defense teams. "Form up! Remember your training!" they called out, though given their fixed position, they looked less like a commanding officer and more like a very militant lawn ornament. The human, who had by now made their way to the auxiliary control room because someone had to be ready when everything inevitably went sideways, noticed that the armor's power fluctuations were getting worse. The quantum-locked neutronium weave was showing stress patterns that looked like an abstract representation of Murphy's Law. "Request emergency shutdown of all X-779 units," they transmitted through the official channels, only to receive an automated response that read, "Request denied. Maintenance personnel are not authorized to question equipment performance during crisis situations. Please file Form X7249B for non-emergency concerns. The pirates, showing the kind of timing that would have impressed a cosmic comedy writer, chose that moment to breach the facility's outer defenses. Their first target, the main power distribution hub, which, coincidentally or not, matched the frequency of the armor's power systems perfectly. In the research lab, Chief Designer Zix 427 Beta was having what humans would call a nervous breakdown, and what their species called a temporary reality readjustment period. They were watching the armor's performance metrics scroll across their screens, each number more concerning than the last. "This is impossible," they muttered, their bioluminescent patches now a color that didn't exist in most visible spectrums. "The simulation said this couldn't happen for at least another 7 standard cycles." The human, who had long since learned that impossible was the universe's favorite challenge, was already implementing their own emergency protocols. These mostly involve being in the right place at the wrong time, with the right tools and wrong paperwork. As the facility's lights flickered and the sound of battle drew closer, Guard Captain Neem 12 made a discovery that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so potentially fatal. The armor's unbreakable quantum-locked neutronium weave was starting to unlock itself, apparently having decided that maintaining molecular cohesion was more of a suggestion than a requirement. The maintenance worker, watching the guards struggle with their increasingly uncooperative armor, was reminded of their childhood robot toy that had malfunctioned during a demonstration at school. The difference being that the toy had only managed to embarrass them in front of their class, not potentially doom an entire research facility. Administrator Vix Ultra Prime, now wearing their ceremonial armor, which was somehow managing to malfunction even more spectacularly than the regular units, was attempting to coordinate a response to the crisis. Their efforts were somewhat hampered by the fact that their armor had decided to interpret every command as an instruction to perform what looked like classical ballet moves. The pirates, who had clearly done their homework, proving that some people really do pay attention during evil scheme planning sessions, were systematically targeting systems that interfered with the armor's already questionable stability. Each hit caused more suits to lock up, freeze, or begin what could only be described as an impromptu performance art piece. The human, watching all of this unfold while gathering tools that would shortly become very relevant, couldn't help but think that sometimes the universe's sense of humor was a bit too on the nose. They had just finished checking their emergency kit when the facility's main power grid decided it had seen enough and promptly shut down, leaving everyone in darkness. Well, almost everyone. The X-779 armor units, in what could only be described as a final act of defiance against both physics and common sense, began to glow. Not the reassuring glow of emergency lighting, but the kind of glow that suggested something was about to go very, very wrong, in a very, very spectacular way. The maintenance worker, who had seen enough equipment failures to write a best-selling disaster novel, knew that the next few minutes would prove once and for all why humans had survived on a death world, and why sometimes the best solution to a problem was good old-fashioned manual override. The pirates, having apparently graduated from the incredibly poor timing Academy of Tactical Decisions, chose this moment to breach the facility's inner defenses. Their entrance would have been more impressive if half their boarding party hadn't tripped over Guard Lieutenant Pixtil, who was still frozen in their power stance, and now served as an impromptu barricade. The human maintenance worker, watching this unfold through the emergency cameras, had reached that special level of done with this situation that sometimes leads to legendary solutions. Or spectacular failures. Often both. "Attention all personnel," the facility's AI announced with artificial cheerfulness. "Hostile forces have breached sectors 7 through 12. Please note that running in panic is not covered by our insurance policy. Have a nice day." In the main corridor, Administrator Vix Ultra Prime was discovering that their ceremonial armor had locked them into what appeared to be a permanent curtsy. "This is outrageous," they declared, their bioluminescence strobing in patterns that would have caused seizures in several species. I demand to speak to the armor's project manager. The pirate leader, a being whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a cactus and a chess master, strode into the facility's central hub. Their own armor, notably not of X-779 design, hummed with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what would happen when they activated their frequency disruptor. Your research facility is now under our control, they announced with theatrical flair, and your famous new armor appears to be having some technical difficulties. The human, who had been methodically making their way through the maintenance tunnels with a tool belt that contained more contingency plans than actual tools, emerged behind a group of guards who were stuck doing what looked like a synchronized swimming routine on dry land. "Hey," they called out to the nearest pirate, who spun around with the kind of grace that suggested they weren't expecting resistance from the maintenance staff. "Quick question about your timing." The pirate, whose species was known for their logical approach to everything, took the bait. "What about our timing?" "Well," the human began, casually stretching their arms in a way that made several aliens nervous. "You didn't think to check who was on maintenance duty during third shift, did you?" Chief Designer Zix 427 Beta, who had managed to waddle their way to the scene in their malfunctioning armor, felt their bioluminescent patches dim in horror as they recognized the maintenance worker. "Oh no," they whispered, remembering all those ignored warning reports. The human's hands moved with the kind of speed that reminded everyone why Deathworlders were so terrifying. They grabbed the nearest locked-up guard's armor at exactly the stress point they'd been warning about for weeks. The one that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought structural integrity was a personal choice. What happened next would be described differently depending on who you asked. The pirates would claim it violated several laws of physics. The guards would insist it was impossible, even as they watched it happen. Administrator Vix Ultra Prime wouldn't say anything at all, as they were still stuck in their curtsy and had fainted anyway. The human, with strength born from a lifetime of living on a planet that actively tried to kill its inhabitants, proceeded to demonstrate exactly why the armor's human-proof rating had been optimistic. Their fingers found the quantum-locked neutronium weave's weak point and, with a grip that would have made a hydraulic press feel inadequate, began to peel it apart. The sound that followed resembled what you might get if you combined 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard with the death cry of a calculator. The armor, which had been advertised as capable of withstanding forces up to 300 times human strength, decided that today was a good day to retire and split apart like wet paper. "That's not possible," shrieked the pirate leader, their confidence evaporating faster than water on a hot plate. The specifications clearly stated, "Yeah," the human interrupted, now holding 2 pieces of what had previously been impenetrable armor. "About those specs. Turns out there's a bit of a difference between lab tests and real-world applications. Also, your frequency disruptor, it's giving me a headache." They punctuated this statement by casually tossing 1 piece of the armor at the disruptor's control panel, demonstrating that while the X-779 might have failed as armor, it made a surprisingly effective projectile. The pirates, showing the kind of tactical wisdom that comes from watching someone tear apart unbreakable technology with their bare hands, decided that perhaps this particular research facility wasn't worth the trouble after all. Their retreat would have been more dignified if they hadn't had to dodge several guards who were still locked in various poses, making the whole scene look like some sort of deranged obstacle course. And as emergency systems finally kicked in and security forces who weren't wearing the X-779 arrived to handle the situation, the human began methodically freeing their colleagues from their malfunctioning armor. Each suit came apart with the kind of ease that suggested they had been practicing this, which, given all their ignored maintenance reports, they technically had been. "I suppose," Administrator Vix Ultra Prime managed to say once they regained consciousness and were freed from their permanent curtsy, "that we should perhaps review our testing protocols." "And maybe," added Chief Designer Zix 427 Beta, watching as their life's work was systematically dismantled by hand, "we should start reading those maintenance reports." The human just nodded, already mentally composing what would become known as the most passive-aggressive incident report in the facility's history. Sometimes, they reflected, the best way to prove a point about equipment safety was to let things go catastrophically wrong, preferably while being the only person who knew how to fix it. As they helped Lieutenant Peter Still out of their power stance prison, they couldn't help but comment, "You know, this is why we have a saying on Earth. If it ain't broke, give it time." The universe, having thoroughly enjoyed its latest demonstration of why humans were classified as Deathworlders, settled back to watch the inevitable committee meetings that would follow. After all, nothing said learning experience quite like having to explain to the board of directors why their unbreakable armor had been turned into modern art by someone whose job description technically didn't include saving the facility from pirates. In the aftermath of what would become known as the incident, because bureaucracies love capitalizing things that embarrass them, the Rigellian Defense Research Institute found itself dealing with several interesting developments. First, there was the emergency board meeting, which set a new record for longest continuous use of the phrase, "How could this happen?" The previous record holder had been the infamous Coffee Maker AI Rebellion of 2287, which at least had the excuse of being caffeinated. The human maintenance worker, now officially titled Emergency Defense Systems Consultant, because person who told you so wasn't considered professional enough, sat through 17 committee meetings in 3 days. They maintained the same expression throughout, the kind that suggested they were mentally calculating how many other unbreakable things in the facility needed a reality check. In light of recent events, Administrator Vix Ultra Prime announced during the final meeting, their bioluminescence notably more subdued than usual, "We are implementing new testing protocols for all defense systems. Additionally, maintenance reports will now be given the same priority as profit projections." Several board members fainted at this last statement. Chief Designer Zix 427 Beta, who had spent the past week re-examining every piece of equipment they'd ever created, made an unprecedented decision. They hired 3 human consultants for their next project, though they insisted on calling them Deathworld Structural Integrity Analysts, because old habits die hard. The pirates, meanwhile, had become somewhat legendary in criminal circles, though not for the reasons they'd hoped. Being driven off by a single maintenance worker had earned them a new nickname, the Ballet Brigade, thanks to security footage of them fleeing through the corridor of posed guards. They were last seen applying for jobs in the entertainment sector, having decided that legitimate theatre might be less embarrassing than failed piracy. Guard Lieutenant Peak Still and Guard Captain Neem 12 found themselves reassigned to equipment testing with a special focus on practical field conditions. This mostly involved them watching humans interact with prototype gear and writing reports that consisted largely of the phrase, "Well, that's not supposed to happen." The X-779 armor, or what remained of it, was displayed in the facility's newly created Learning from Mistakes Museum, right next to the self-aware coffee maker, and a warning sign that read overconfidence not just for organic beings anymore. As for the maintenance worker, they received both a commendation and a formal reprimand. The commendation was for saving the facility. The reprimand was for excessive efficiency in demonstrating equipment flaws. They framed both documents and hung them in their workshop, right next to their updated emergency procedures checklist, which now included rapid unplanned disassembly as a feature rather than a bug. The Galactic Defense Corps, in a stunning display of bureaucratic adaptability, revised their equipment testing standards. The new protocols required all unbreakable items to be certified by what they delicately termed gravitationally challenged planetary inhabitants, because apparently saying Deathworlders in official documents was still considered impolite. "You know what the real irony is?" the human remarked one day, while helping install the decidedly less ambitious X-780 reasonably durable armor system. "If they'd just read my first maintenance report, the one about the power distribution looking like a modern art interpretation of a headache, None of this would have happened. Administrator Vix Ultra Prime, who happened to be passing by, pretended not to hear this. Their new standard-issue armor, notably designed with input from 3 different Deathworld species, creaked in what might have been agreement. The universe, ever the fan of poetic justice, seemed satisfied with this outcome. After all, it had managed to teach several valuable lessons. Never ignore maintenance reports. Don't call anything unbreakable until a human has tried to break it, and perhaps most importantly, sometimes the best qualification for saving the day is simply being too stubborn to file a proper vacation request. In the end, the facility updated its emergency alert system to include a 4th setting. Human was right. It was used surprisingly often after that, though always with the kind of resignation that suggested someone was going to have to rewrite a lot of safety protocols. And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic archives of the Galactic Defense Corps, a new regulation was added to the official handbook. In the event of equipment labeled unbreakable, impenetrable, or absolutely safe, please consult nearest Deathworlder for a second opinion, preferably before the warranty expires. The human kept the piece of quantum lock neutronium weave on their desk as a paperweight. Sometimes, late during 3rd shift, they could swear they heard it whimpering whenever they reached for it, but that was probably just their imagination. Probably.